All right. Hello, everybody. We're here to talk NFL fantasy. I am Josh Landon. I'm here with Brandon Kelley, co-host of the Always Shooting podcast. And we're here with three of our Patreon supporters, Dave Wegner-Lodahl, Eric Freeman, and Mike DePietro. I think at least 2 out of 3 of you are producer patrons as well. So thanks, gentlemen, for coming on. And Brennan and I have talked about this a lot over the last few months. I have had my first NFL fantasy experience in about 15 years. I did it when I was in college. I was in the Schuler Books in the East Lansing, Michigan, the Schuler Books Fantasy League. Won it the first time I did it, and then the second year I finished last. So
How competitive is an NFL fantasy club at an independent bookstore?
It's just like everywhere. It's just like everywhere. It's like any fantasy league in any form. You have 3 people who take it hyper seriously and 11 people who don't care at all, right? They care for like a week. And so it's but it was a fun experience, but I finished last the second year, and it was just like, it was kind of contentious. People were starting to get mad at each other. It was a really trade heavy league. And so there were constantly proposals getting thrown out and people getting mad about the quality of and it was like, I felt like I was an actual GM, like the amount of calls I felt like we were all fielding for this league. So it's kind of like, I think I'm done with fantasy. And when Brennan, like 5 or 6 years later, was like, hey, I want to do, this is like long before the podcast, I want to do, Premier League fantasy. I actually think I said no the first time you asked me. I was like, I don't think I want to do this. And then I got the bug, and obviously we've been playing in our Always Cheating League for 10 years now. And then this fall, Dave said, hey, I think you should you kind of like bullied me into it, Dave. I think you were like, you just come do this. And he's like, not only are you going to do this, but I'm going to do a podcast with you where I talk about fantasy, and I'm going to explain, how it all works. And much like with Premier League Fantasy, I was reluctant, and then I loved it. I had a great experience. I was in that league with a couple of people who were on this Zoom call, and I really had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot from it too. I really learned about like how different the 2 leagues are, how similar they are in some ways, the kind of people that it brings out, the content that gets created around it. Because everyone here except for Brandon, who's kind of like the moderator of this discussion, even though I'm doing all of the talking right now, is here.
Your time will be called soon enough, Josh.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to do like chess style. I'm going to like tap the button here. But 4 out of 5 of us have done NFL fantasy. Brandon, would you ever consider doing fantasy yourself, NFL fantasy?
Well, I think the thing that gives you pause as a true FPL player is you think about all the emotional intensity that comes with, and all of the time that it takes to get your team ready. Now, based on what Eric was talking about earlier, about he's graduated to this level of FPL where it only takes him 20 minutes to make a decision each week. Fantastic.
Yeah, he's more advanced than we are, though.
My problem with NFL is I don't know anything about it. So this is what I always say about how did 2 American guys get into FPL. It's like, well, I wanted to be more conversant about the Premier League, and the fantasy game was a great immersion program. So if my complaint about not wanting to play NFL fantasy is I don't know anything about NFL and it sounds like a huge time suck, well, the best way to get to know the NFL is to play the fantasy game. So that's kind of where I am at. I'm waiting for that moment where I decide I actually do want to know more about NFL. I'm not sure if I'm there yet, though.
Well, people are listening, and they're kind of on the fence too. I will say that I found the investment, and so basically, I want to talk a little bit about the strengths of both games, the weaknesses of both games, and then kind of just like whether like the strengths that you might have in one cross over to the other. And I think those are sort of three kind of key things that I think we can talk about here. But Brandon, I will say that my level of investment was, and maybe it was because it was my first time doing it, but I felt like it was short on prep and short on like work, and long on spending my Sundays watching NFL Red Zone, which was amazing. And it's like, I mean, it was like from a like work to entertainment, ratio, I find it a lot higher than the Premier League, to be honest. I mean, I love the Premier League more. I love the fantasy game more. Like, I don't want to sound like I made some massive switch in terms of my allegiances, but I really enjoyed how. I mean, there are Thursday games, there are Sunday night games, there are Monday night games, but really, it's this block of time from 1 p.m. to like 7:30 or whatever, where if you have red zone, you're just watching goals. It's like goal rush, but like in a sport where like people are scoring, all the time. So
now let's pop over to Wolves Stadium to see a shot go off the crossbar.
Yeah, just to watch a corner kick, right? It doesn't really work, So, Eric, I'll let you start things off here a little bit because you won the first ever Always Cheating Patreon Fantasy League this year. And one thing that makes it tricky, actually, and this is Mike was not in this league. I think the call went out and then like all the spots got filled up in like 1 minute. It was like if you were on during that 1 minute window, you got in. So we'll try to fix that. But usually I think it's restricted to 12 typically. Is how many people you can usually have in a league. At least that was the one we put on ours.
Oh no. Au contraire.
Really?
Oh
wow.
No. We can go a 16 deep next year.
But please, let's not.
That's my jam.
I thought even with 12, I was like looking for like backup running backs who might get me,
Well, even with 12, you started Michael Carter on the Jets in the championship game against the Buccaneers, who have the best run defense in the league.
He had 7 points in the first quarter. Okay. If he doesn't go off with an injury, I beat Eric in the final. So
that's not true.
Yeah.
Oh yes. I love this. All right. Let Eric speak. Let him speak.
Yeah. So Eric, I wanted to, can you say how long you've been playing NFL fantasy for, and then B, what you enjoyed about this particular season, or what made this a winning season for you?
Yeah. So I've been playing since I was 13. I remember my first draft. We were in the conference room at my church, and we were a junior high league, and we were all drafting players on paper and pen, and then plugging them manually into the computer later. So this was my 20th season playing, and most years I'm in 2 leagues, sometimes more. I've been in as many as 6 or 7 leagues at a time. So I go way back with this as my main fantasy game. Done fantasy baseball too and some other things, but and then what are the strengths? Is that the question?
Yeah, or I mean, I don't know. Like, I mean, so I guess maybe the more interesting question is just, I mean, you've been doing it for 20 years. Like, what keeps you hanging around the NFL game?
It's because I'm a Lions fan and I have nothing else to cheer for. That is honestly.
That's basically to translate. That's like being a Chesterfield fan in the UK, non-league side. Got to have another rooting interest.
It's and that's genuine too. I mean, like, I would not be watching NFL if it weren't for fantasy football, because the lines have been terrible for so long and it's just not worth my time. And so it just keeps me interested. The game itself, I think, is the best fantasy game out there in terms of strategy. My favorite part is draft day. It's like one of my favorite days of the entire year. There's nothing that compares to draft day for fantasy NFL. So it's got a lot going for it.
Yeah. And I mean, so, with all that said, I mean, you did get into the Premier League, to fantasy Premier League. I mean, what drew you in? What kept you around if you enjoy NFL fantasy so much?
Yeah, well, I think it was the same reason why you guys got into it. Is I was becoming a soccer fan and I wanted to know more about the game and more outside just the one team that I was following. And so the fantasy game seemed to be a good way to do that. And I found your podcast like about the same time that I started playing too. And so to have conversation partners was one of the ways that kept me in it. But yeah, so I don't enjoy FPL, the game, as much. Not even close, I would say. There's just a lot less strategy and a lot more frustration. But it keeps me watching the Premier League, which that's what I appreciate the most.
Dave, what do you think about that? The strategy question. I mean, I sort of am of 2 minds about the strategy part of it, because in some ways I think there's more strategy in fantasy. But then down the stretch in the NFL season, I felt like I was really flexing that strategy muscle to the same degree. I feel like the first few weeks I was sort of like, I had my drafted team and I was just sort of letting it roll, So what do you think about the strategy question?
I guess it depends how you define strategy, because FPL, you have the salary cap and you have to know if you transfer this person out, then you can get this person in, and it's a math game, and there's planning and there's a decision tree, and there's a lot of different things you can go through with that. Whereas NFL, I think there is more strategy in that you can grind harder and you will get better results in NFL, like no question, looking at the waiver wires and just really grinding your team. The draft is like super fun, but it's less than half the game for sure. It's in-season moves, sit-start decisions. So I think,
Dave, when you say grind harder, do you mean grind harder than other people in your NFL league, or is it just like independently? If you just grind hard, you'll see results. Because I think that is that's what's compelling to me about draft style is how you're not necessarily trying to work on the margins like you often are in FPL.
I mean, it's both. It's like you have to know who's up, who's trending down, and where you have to make those pivots. And this guy's a backup now, but there's a X% chance he could be a starter, and it's worth having those lottery tickets deep on your bench. Whereas with FPL, you're just trying to get as many points in your 11 as possible, which is kind of the same thing here. You're trying to get points, but I think especially with NFL, which I kind of like, and I think maybe Eric was saying this too, is that like there's a lot more like understanding how to control your bench and your whole roster over a season. There's a lot more variables and tricks of the trade you can do to ensure you have a better shot at winning and get more wins. So yeah, so I'd agree that there is more strategy you can use to ensure you're a better player, but both games have high variance, of course, but yeah.
Yeah, and to explain a little bit of that grind too, it's you heard of that that thing that people do where they start with a paperclip and they try to trade the paperclip for something more valuable, then eventually they get a house, right?
Yeah, right.
That is what you can do in fantasy NFL. I was in 2 leagues this year and I started both 1 and 4, I think, and I won both. Because when you're
with a paperclip at quarterback,
with a paperclip of a team, right? and that's the appeal, is that you're never completely out of it until you're out of it, because you can trade and add. So you're rewarded for your efforts for sure.
Well, Mike, let's bring you in on this discussion a little bit too. I mean, how long have you been playing both for? I mean, I know that you are a pretty serious Premier League guy. I mean, I believe you did a big trip to the UK with your buddies, right? Like you're sort of long time Premier League. Like you're a dual guy, right? Dual.
Yeah,
guy,
very much so. Yeah, very much so. Although I'm very similar to what Eric was saying. I don't think we got the exact year count on Dave, but for Eric, I'm about 20 years in from fantasy football, American football perspective, and yes, and very similar. I got into FPL because I think just this is my perspective growing up. Like once I discovered fantasy sports, that was like, if I'm going to watch and be into a sport, like I want to play fantasy, So basically, I just kind of found FPL once I knew I was going to start investing my time in watching, the matches. So
I think, by the way, can we agree that NFL and Premier League are the only, like, I don't know, I've dipped my toe in NBA fantasy and Major League Baseball fantasy. Do not enjoy either one. I do not enjoy having to reset like the starters in baseball is like hell, and NBA it's like it's 3 matches for some teams, 2 for us.
It's schedule based. It's really tough.
Have you ever played fantasy golf?
No, I've never done fantasy. Have you done fantasy golf, Eric?
I have played, and I was going to ask Mike this, like, what's the weirdest fantasy sport you played?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I think I have played fantasy golf at one point.
You guys are degenerates. Holy crap.
But that
any,
was like
any fantasy F1 players out there?
Have you ever planted?
Yeah, I mean,
have
that's
you ever
a
played
game,
Fantasy Bachelor?
Yes, Fantasy Real World, Rolos Challenge.
There's a fantasy game for everything.
No, there is. I know that what Josh, to your point, I mean, one thing I would say about definitely for baseball, I mean, this is more if, you know, you were saying like the pitchers kind of, if you'd have to find the right league and everybody's on board with it. But I've played in a league before where you set your lineup once it locks. So you set it for the week.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you have to pick like which starting pitchers, and we don't need to go into fantasy baseball, but just
Sure.
quickly,
Yeah.
I was saying like if it was something that, you know, you don't have those, there's like those daily games, like so many games in baseball, so many games in basketball, you can find rule settings, which is something maybe we'll get into, is like the ability to change rules within a league to league, to make it more fun for you, right? So anyways,
I think the rule stuff, and we can talk about that now a little bit, because I think that it's kind of the greatest. Is it the greatest? I don't know. It's one of the weaknesses of the fantasy game is also one of its strengths, I think, which is that it's, you know, it really is like, it's the same game that we started playing a decade ago, Brandon. You know, I mean, it's really very little. I mean, they added the chips.
Sure, but the chips are just a distraction. Like the core principles of the game remain the same.
Yeah, exactly. The core principles in like the last couple of years have been pretty chaotic, and I think if you had just started playing fantasy Premier League the last couple of years, I you know, it honestly was a lot less stressful before this, right? With all the postponements and you know, it was a little more like NFL, I think. But anyway, the barrier to entry is pretty simple. The game is pretty much the same, and there's not a lot of adaptability. And the worry that I have a little bit right now, and I think it ultimately is going to force the site to change, is a seed that Dave planted in my head like 12 weeks ago when we did or 20 weeks ago when we did the fantasy NFL pod, which is that he was saying that he's, you know, there's a worry that fantasy Premier League is going to basically get solved, you know, like it's limit poker, right? Where it's just sort of like, this is how you're supposed to play everything. And you know, and I mean,
the minute I find out Matt Damon is playing FPL, I'm out.
Yeah. And, you know, it's just like, I wish that there was some more, you know, like it's cool that we're all competing on this. Like, it's like a massive golf tournament with 8 million players, you know, like there is something really exciting and cool about that. But there are times when I'm like, you know what, I almost wish I could pull back from that and just have my own little league with 10 people, and we could kind of make up the rules, and we could give, you know, midfielders points for blocks, clearances, and interceptions, or, you know what I mean? Like, just like add some different things to the game so that it wasn't just like, all right, this is Mo Salah is going to be everyone's captain for the rest of the season, you know, or like maybe we don't have captains in our league, right? Like, you know, or like just, you know, like the way that Dave set up the NFL league. And I know that Dave, when we talked about this, you know, in late summer, you were talking about all the different ways that you can set things up, but even just the way that you set our league up, I thought was kind of interesting. Do you want to just explain the basic rules that you set up for the fantasy game, just for anyone who's listening who maybe has never done fantasy NFL before, like how like the kind of teams looked, you know, like what the structures look like?
Yeah, I can just go through this really quickly. We did, the most important thing is full PPR, because we were full fun league. And number two was, because we're a Premier League podcast, we did no kickers.
What's PPR stand for?
No clue.
Points per reception. Points per reception.
Everything you say, you've got to be looking at Brendan Kelley for.
Yeah,
okay? He's our he's going to keep us you know, whatever. Like keep us.
I'm your lodestar.
Yeah, exactly.
This knowledge is just going to go through your head like a sieve.
But the points per reception thing, is big, right? Because when I was playing NFL fantasy like 15 years ago, it was a little bit like fantasy Premier League, where it was like, you know, you just had your like, you know, a couple of stars, you know, a couple star running backs. And they sort of like, if you had, you know, Priest Holmes, in my case, I had Priest Holmes and he had like 32 touchdowns that season. That was pretty much it, you know? But I, you know, I think that like the way that you did it was you gave wide receivers as much, because, you know, obviously like just running backs score more touchdowns than wide receivers, right? It's just like they get the ball at the 1 yard line more often, right? Like it's more likely to score. And so you sort of elevated wide receivers, that you had 3 wide receivers that you could start. You could actually, I guess, technically start 4, and that they got a point for every time they just caught the ball. And so that really kind of elevated them, and it sort of flattened things out a little bit. So you had wide receivers and running backs were sort of equal value.
Yep, that's right. And 2 running backs. And that's why another more popular rules coming into the game are elevating tight ends with tight end premium and elevating quarterback with super flex. So you have to start 2 quarterbacks, because right now it's quarterbacks sort of a not very interesting position. So that's where the trends are going to make the game fun, to elevate all the positions so they're all kind of at more equal importance, rather than you're just kind of punting quarterback, punting tight end. A lot of teams do and can succeed that way. So that's how we set up our league.
Just the idea of things being changed to make the game more fun, like immediately makes me frustrated as a someone who creates fantasy content, like for the Premier League. Like, guys, like
why is there a whole block of midfielders in the FPL game that are obsolete and unusable in fantasy? And how can we solve that problem, or at least
come to DraftKings? Come to DraftKings, Brandon.
Yeah, or just like, I mean,
many leagues who want to solve it can. Yeah, you don't have to.
Or come to Fantasy Bundesliga, right? I mean, Eric is,
MLS
is still
too,
an FBL dude. But the one, Mike, did you jump into the Fantasy Bundesliga a couple years ago? The pandemic Bundesliga that we all dipped our toe in.
I did, and I tried
the fever.
Yeah, and I tried to start again this year. And I'll be honest, like I think where I struggled, I guess there's two reasons. One, as I mentioned before, if I'm going to be watching something, I want to be playing fantasy. I just don't have the schedule bandwidth to add Bundesliga matches, right? Yep. So I wasn't watching enough. So then I lost interest in playing the game. Also, I just got bit too many times, and I think this is because I wasn't watching enough. Like you have to be really engaged. I mean, Eric can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like with Bundesliga to do well, you have to be like engaged. Like, okay, it's match day again. Like I gotta swap in, change my star player. Like there's a lot of, it's very, I think that's fun if that's like the league you like, and that's, I think that's a fun thing. But if you're gonna try to approach it as more of a casual, and I know that sounds like a bad term sometimes, but like I mean it.
We know you
like
mean,
I don't, I don't mean it in a bad way here. Like I'm a casual when it comes to Bundesliga fantasy. It becomes difficult in my opinion. So that's why I wish I could do more, but I kind of dropped off on it.
Yeah, and if you don't have like friends who are kind of pulling you along, I think that makes it a little trickier.
While we're talking about the rules, I mean, before we let the conversation go farther, I guess Josh, what was your like favorite part of the game itself, and what was your sort of least favorite part of the game itself, do you feel like?
Yeah, I mean, favorite part was actually watching the games. Like, I mean, honestly, like just watching the games with this fantasy investment, I just thought that Red Zone was just a blast. And Red Zone was fun already. Like it was fun just as a casual fan, but I wasn't subscribing to it. It's it's an add-on on YouTube TV. Like, it's like, I wasn't like, I was like, building Sundays around or anything. I mean, I guess I still kind of wasn't, but it's like
a little bit like Josh,
long,
Sunday comes around and the games are going and it's like watching your Bitcoin stock go up and down. You're basically mapping what you're seeing on the TV in real time to what's on your phone, your fantasy score. Whereas like that's another thing that we could get into with FPL is how the points are sort of like dripping and then the calculation.
Well, I think that is part of the fun, is that it's like, it's really hard not to be getting like not to be accruing points. Yeah. Like basically like the second matches start, right? Like you're just, like, I mean, your defense, you start off with 10 points, right? It's like, you can lose them, but like it's, you sort of, the matches, the games kick off and it's like, all right, your quarterback's made some passes. Great. Like Aaron Rodgers has 2 completions. I'm already picking up points. My running backs have, run for X number of yards already. I've got points there. And so, unlike fantasy where you can spend 90 minutes watching a game and then have nothing good happen the entire time. It's like a very common experience. It is like, there is something fun about watching your points sort of slowly climb. And so that, that I enjoyed. I don't want to make it sound like, I mean, I think that, I don't think anyone's going to like question my FPL, bona fides or anything like that. But, I think it was a little more like wind it up and watch, like the strategy part of fantasy, I still prefer of FPL. I mean, I really do love deliberating, deliver my decisions. But I think the thing I liked least was I thought the waiver wire was sort of frustrating because I mean, honestly, I just sort of shot out to an early lead in that in our NFL league. I got kind of lucky early on. I don't think I really knew what I was doing yet. But I was in a position where I basically never got any of the players that I wanted because I was always like at the bottom of the waiver order. And so that was sort of frustrating because I felt like it kind of took some of the strategy out for me because I was sort of like seeing who was left on Wednesday. Once the way it works, Brandon, is that you have all the games finish on Monday with Monday Night Football, and then the next day basically it's like waiver claim day. I mean, you can make them before that Tuesday, but they sort of all get in, and then correct me if I'm wrong here, gentlemen, but like I feel like it's like whoever is lowest in the league gets the first waiver pick.
I think
right?
that's how
It
I set
depends.
ours up.
Yeah, you can. That's another thing you could tweak, right?
Oh,
The
big
two
time.
main,
Tweak it.
the
Okay.
two, like I would say, the two main ways to do it are the way it sounds like you had it set up, where yes, it's very much your waiver priority is set based on your success, but although it usually then updates, meaning like if I had the number one waiver because I was the worst or whatever, and then I take somebody, usually then at least my experience is it would drop you then down.
Yeah, I don't like
to-
that.
you
That
don't like
stresses
that.
me out. I
Okay.
don't like having that.
Well, somebody does that, and then the
Yeah.
other way, the way I like it personally the most is when you have a budget.
Yeah.
Fab,
So
yeah.
fab.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of every season, everybody has the same, $100, let's say. And then so then there's a strategy there, right? Then that strategy comes into play. Like, so you have to decide how much do I want to really spend to acquire this player, or how much do I think Dave is going to spend?
Right.
to
It's
acquire,
a blind auction at that point, right?
Exactly.
Mike?
So everybody submits
Dutch
their
auction,
submits their bid, and then whoever bid the highest, gets them. And if it's a tie, then there is actually a priority, I think.
And you do you do the draft that way too? It's like
Yeah, so I have two different. I do have a couple of leagues that are auction style, and I have a couple that are draft just because they've always been draft. I actually have come to really like auction more. Dave may disagree. I just think there's more skill in auction a little bit, but I think if there's any listeners that want to dip their toe into fantasy football, American football, definitely don't do auction. Do a draft, do a snake draft.
Yeah,
like,
Eric, I want to hear. Yeah, you're nodding. I want to hear your take on draft versus auction, because I think both have their pros and cons, obviously.
Sure.
Yeah, I've done auction a few times. I just don't like it. It's nothing more than that. It's just not as fun for me. It's not as fun of an experience.
It's very long. I think it's overrated slightly, because it is in a snake draft. It's more of a structure. So you're right, Mike. Literally, like, there's more strategy because anyone could have any player. So obviously, how you rate the players will come through in your auction. But I think there's sort of like this weird meta strategy with the auction and the flow, and it's like 3 hours long, and people get loopy at the end. And like 2 hours in, you get a $2 receiver who pops, and like, I don't know, that's kind of like lucky too. So I like the snake as well.
All right. Well, just so I don't sound too traitorous here, what do you guys think are the worst parts of NFL fantasy? Like, what do you dislike? I mean, starting off with Eric. Surely, Eric, even though you're strongly in favor of NFL fantasy, there's gonna be something you don't like, something you don't enjoy.
I guess you can't. You're not going to win if you don't put time in, I guess. So there's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot, is that you don't win the league at draft day. So very, very rarely do you draft the perfect team, because injuries. I mean, NFL players are constantly getting injured, and you've got to make moves to get them in. Right. And so if you just want to have some kind of set and forget team, it's not possible. And so I've had friends who I've tried to get into fantasy NFL who were hoping for a less intense experience, and therefore don't like that. So that'd be the one downside.
Okay. What do you think, Mike?
I'll say I've had experiences where you can feel very much out of it early in the season. And I know we talked about grinding and all that, which is true. Like, you can have some bad luck, you can have a couple of things go wrong, and you definitely can recover. But also, you can have some really bad luck. I mean, you can lose. I mean, like, we're talking about injuries. Like, I've been doing it for 20 years. Like I said, you have some seasons where you've got like 3 of your best players all get hit with injuries, or weird things happen, and then also, I mean, no matter how much you play the waiver wire,
there must be a weird court case in there somewhere, Mike.
Yeah, there's a court case, there's I mean, who knows, but like, but like, you can just get, the raw end of that deal, and then it can be kind of, it just can be kind of a bummer. So like, what are you playing for? I mean, it's kind of like pride at that point, but it's like, it's hard to stay as engaged at the point. Whereas in FPL, the nice thing is, like, You can have a bad start to the season, but like you're not, I mean, there's a wild card. We all know the rules,
Yeah,
right?
it's a long season.
You can kind of,
yeah.
you can really like reset. You can really, there's a lot of ways to kind of regroup, and you can't reset on your NFL draft. So
I think I kind of would agree with that a little bit, because even though I ended up having a very good season, I had a week where I lost Derrick Henry to season-ending injury. Aaron Rodgers came out as not having actually been vaccinated, and one of my wide receivers was in a drunk driving accident, and somebody died in the accident. He immediately got cut from his team, so I lost 3 players in a week. And the Derrick Henry thing actually kind of sowed the seeds for my eventual loss, I feel like, because I spent the next 8 or 9 weeks trying to find a running back, like just trying to find one running back who could get me more than, and now granted, I mean, Eric did a better job of this because he picked up someone like Rashad Penny, who was maybe sitting there, and I just didn't, I wasn't savvy enough to see that. But I felt like personally, I was just like, it is, so it's a little different than, because in the Premier League, it's like if somebody does well, you can almost kind of immediately block them, like you can bring them in yourself, right? And so you sort of neutralize that player. But if they're doing, but if you're in a league where someone's just destroying because of a couple, guys, like there's really not a lot you can do except hope they get injured, right?
This gets to something very intriguing to me about NFL fantasy. Mike and Josh, you just spoke about the ability to recover, which is based on your draft, but it's also based on the length of the season. FPL is forgiving because the season is so bloody long, but also that can be a drag. You see so many people drop out of FPL around the holidays because it's just going on and on and on, and life gets in the way. NFL is much more focused into a 12-week period of time. So this must be a huge cauldron of energy. Like that, when you think about your experience playing FPL, Dave, versus NFL, like that must come into play.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes into play. The length of season. The annoying part of NFL is you can spend a decade playing the game and never win, and just because you pretty much ran cold, like you can be good, just never win. It's frustrating.
You can do that in FPL too, Dave. Take it from me.
That's true.
Well, there's more like, oh, what's your rank and your mainly, I don't know, you can like set other goals. But I think what's interesting, the difference, I think we were kind of getting towards like differences, plus and minus of the games as well, is what I think is interesting is in NFL is I think you can bring in more from the FPL game of the player profiling, because NFL has so many stats, we can lean on those and projections and so many plays, and you can map those out and put a number on it. Whereas FPL, when new players come in, or it's like, what is this guy like? What's his speed? What's his strengths? How do you think he'll be deployed? Do you think he'll be doing this? And it's much more about their like physicality in the game, and will this impact fantasy? Whereas NFL is a little less like that because it's just so much more numbers based. And I was even looking just at Eric's draft right now, and he's obviously a very good player of fantasy. But I gotta say, Eric, like half of your team are like dusty, injury-prone dudes. So like
shots fired. All right, let's give Eric a moment to respond to this, Dave.
So I think it's amazing. No, and he's really good at working the wire too. So I think it's interesting. You can play so many different ways and deploy so many different strategies, go for value, injury risks, and just more about deeper of understanding who the players are and their background and where they are in their careers. I think helps with NFL quite a bit. I think Eric's got a good handle on that.
Eric, how does it feel to have your head patted by somebody whose ass you kicked this season in the NFL fantasy?
I don't know. I mean, I could just show him that guitar back there that I bought with our league prize money.
Nice. Wow, that's awesome.
I remember wiring you the cash. So
yes.
No worries.
That's awesome.
Sorry, Mike, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, I was, as Dave was talking, it kind of jogged my memory too on like another thing that can be frustrating about, fantasy football, is that you can have a really, on the contrary to like kind of what I said before, you can have like a really good team and a really good season and like even miss the playoffs in fantasy league, or just get, not finish like, in the top as you, because like they'll show you, total points for, total points against, and like I've had leagues where I like by like hundreds of points have the most points, but I'm in like third or fourth place just because on that given week the guy I played had his best week of the season. You know what I mean? And that can be frustrating, but also it's what makes it sort of fun the same way, like, any given week that you go into, it's like a sports cliche, but like any given week, you go into a fantasy matchup, even though I'm playing Dave and he's number one, he's crushing everybody. Well, my team could just go bananas that week and beat him, and it's fun, so.
Yeah.
I do like the highest points against paid out. I should have brought that into this league. That's a good, like, a little, here's your at least your buyback. If you got steamrolled by points against, you'll get some cash. So I like that rule too.
All right. Well, I have one question here that I wanted to bring into the conversation. Francis says, I stopped, he was in our league this year. He says, I stopped playing the fantasy game with you guys after a mistake I made. I somehow accidentally transferred out my quarterback, and I asked on Slack, could people let me
Eric
get him
is
back?
disgusted right now.
However, he was picked up by another player in our league. Realizing my plight, that player then offered him back to me, but as part of a transfer that would have cost me other valuable assets, instead of just dropping the quarterback to the waiver wire where I could have picked him up. Question for the pod: was this a dick move, or is all fair in love and fantasy?
Wow, what's the story there? Who was the other who was the other manager?
Who is the other manager? It wasn't you, Eric.
Eric's gonna bring up Eric's gonna bring up the TikTok of what happened there. But I will first of all lay the blame of being the commissioner. I was the absent commissioner. I set up the league. The draft went swimmingly. Then I didn't do anything and didn't check in with anyone, check Slack or anything, even though Josh was pinging me. And then I paid out everyone at the end. So as a commissioner, I can be better of understanding week to week what people are doing, any complaints, and keep people updated on. So I'll just say I can be better next year. I'll be better, coach, play better. Yeah.
Fair. I mean, I you set it up. I mean, I had to learn. Yeah, there's a lot of like learning the hard way. I felt like I was definitely having to but I mean, sometimes that's the best way to learn is just like sort of figure it out, trial and error. So,
but Eric, if you drop someone, I mean, that's on you. So in the end.
Yeah, well, it was a confusing situation, and we don't need to get, nobody cares. So we don't need to get into it.
Sounds like Francis cares.
Francis cares, and we've explained it all multiple times. And I thought I was trying to help in the way that I was trying to resolve a situation, and apparently it was not interpreted that way.
I'm sure you helped in the long run, Eric. We all are better people, regardless.
There's a lot of learning all around.
I just want to say that it takes 2 clicks to confirm a drop. So,
yeah, we need, it's the great call for dual factor authentication on the FPL site. Let's get this into the draft game too.
Yeah.
I had a thought about strategy. I'm not even really sure there's a way to answer to ask this question. I mean, I guess my thinking was, are people who are good at NFL fantasy also good at FPL, or is there is it like a different skill set? Or, I mean, Mike, as somebody who's done both for a long time, do you think that like having a good, I don't know. I mean, do you think those skills are transferable, or do you think it's kind of a different way of playing the game entirely?
I mean, I think they're very different games. But I mean, I think there's certain just skill sets that, like playing fantasy sports for a while, like they're like inherent skill sets that you kind of just develop, like in terms of I just like that sounds silly, but like dedication, like just the commitment to it,
Yep.
Learning like the ins and outs, like I don't know, that kind of thing I think is but I think but in the games themselves, I mean they're very, very different, so I think it's very possible there'd be players that are just like very good at FPL, but would really struggle to have the same level of success in NFL fantasy. Not saying they couldn't be a good player, but like if you're saying like I'm going to be just as good at FPL as I am in NFL fantasy, or vice versa, like I think it's possible that may not be the case.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what do you think about that?
From my experience, the best players in both games are professional poker players, and gamblers are the dominant players in both fantasy football and Premier League. And I think that's because they understand statistics and like metagame theory and all that stuff. And I think that's like the most transferable skill. But I do agree with Mike that you can definitely be good in one and bad the other, because I think it's just psychologically they're so wildly different, that especially for just a fantasy player. But if you're like a numbers person and understand odds and game theory and things like that, I think you could easily dominate both, and people have.
Yeah, I mean,
I think I'm a good example of where I've struggled to translate the NFL to FPL up until the season, where I think this is my 5th season of FPL, and my first 4 seasons have been awful, like really bad compared to like the general FPL community. And it's because I didn't learn patience, because you're not supposed to be patient in fantasy NFL. Like that's not rewarded, and you need to be patient in FPL. One thing that I have found that maybe FPL people could benefit from by playing fantasy NFL is understanding what there's more than just like the fixture difficulty rating, like in the greens and reds and grays that go into like, so like Tampa Bay defense would be a great example. Do you want to start any player that's playing Tampa Bay against Tampa Bay? Well, no, it depends on what position. You don't want to start a running back because they have a great D line and run stopping D line, but you probably want to start a wide receiver because their defensive backs aren't as good, and you're probably playing catch up the rest of the game. And that can transfer over into FPL by, I think this last week, just using an example, would be like, yeah, Lamptey was a good pick because he's going up against Alonso. Now, if he played on the other side of the pitch, maybe not, because he's going up against Azpilicueta or some other better player. But when he's going, so there's just position by position correlations that NFL teaches you to pay attention to, or even like when does a replacement gain more value, or when do they lose value based on who else is on the field? And we saw that with Bruno this last week, and how much better he is when Ronaldo's not on.
I think that kind of strategic thinking could be improved. And maybe that's something, Brendan, you and I can even think about for the podcast. Is like, there's like just certain things like in NFL fantasy that they just like give you like data. They just give you on the page, like, oh, like, Tennessee has the 4th best passing defense or something like that. Right. But I feel like when you talk about match, like bringing in players, it's like you very much look at like, just like how good is their defense. You kind of look at it like collectively, and you don't always think about like how, like the way I was talking about Ronaldo a minute ago, right? Like sometimes I feel like that doesn't get talked about enough. Like how will Ronaldo do against 2 C-level center backs, right? And it's like, and I feel like sometimes that does get lost a little bit in the FPL discussion. There could be a little more of that kind of strategy included. I think I agree with Dave though in general. I think that I mean, as somebody, I'm not a professional gambler or poker player, but I'm somebody who really likes both and has a lot of interest in both. And I think that probably does help me, or did help me to bring them over, because it's just like a basic, like a sense of like, I think it's just like a sense of like being in control, right? There's like a kind of feeling like, okay, like this, like I'm not going to trust my instincts at all, and I'm just going to like kind of trust what I'm like, what seems logical, and that's really what like being good at gambling is all about, right? It's like sort of just like letting your feelings. I mean, like, it's not like you don't have to be like you don't have to like look at like a stat table necessarily, but just like sort of let like logic take over a little bit, and I think that's a skill that works in both sports. So, all right. Brandon, any final questions or thoughts, or did this like get anything like, did make you think about anything? Or
You're in for next year. You're in for next year, right?
I very well might be. I mean, as listeners of this podcast will know, I spent a whole summer without live television, and now that I'm reacquainted with live TV, sports have become more and more a part of my life, of watching weird things like the National Basketball Association. So I could see a world in which the NFL works for me. But my final thought is basically what players who have played this for 20 years, just thinking about all the memories, all the friends. I love it. Like that's what it's all about. Like, I remember reading this article in this is what a coda to the Zoom call, an article I read in a New York Times Sunday magazine about a guy who he was afraid to leave his NFL fantasy league because he's been playing in it for 30 plus years because of he'd lose touch with his friends. It's the only way in which he keeps in touch with certain people. So I just love it when I talk to people who've been playing any particular fantasy game for that long, because I know that those bonds are there, and it's great. So I guess that means I have to play NFL fantasy next year if I ever want to see Mike DePietro again.
I think that's a good point. That it's a good point. Yeah, exactly. Just for Mike alone, I think we've got to get you in. But I think you're right, because I think it's sort of I mean, maybe like the final takeaway here is like, whether one game is better than the other, it's like it's the game that you got, right? Like you pick the game that you know, if you're already a big NFL fan and you're not doing NFL fantasy, I suggest doing it. You know, if somebody's on the other side of it and they're a big Premier League fan and they don't do Premier League fantasy, I would suggest that as well. If you want to learn a little more, do it. But ultimately, it's like, you know, the sport that you love the most is probably gonna be the one that you invest the most in terms of, you know, the fantasy game. So that's you know, the Premier League game, could it be better? Yes. Do we talk about how we want to fix it all the time? But I have no intention of stopping playing. You know, I would like the game to be better. Like, do better is how I feel a lot of the time. Like, you know, like it's like you did it once, you did the free hit, like keep doing this stuff. Like, you know, they give a second free hit. It's like, keep, like, do it all the time. Like, keep people engaged. Like, don't treat it like it's totally like a guarantee that no one will ever leave or no one will ever get burned out. We know that people get burned out all the time and quit. Like, what can you do? Like, it doesn't have to be hacky, like weird stuff, but just like, you know, acknowledge like, yeah, 35 matches have been canceled. Like, maybe we should like have free hits, or like let people like make transfers until a minute before the deadline or whatever. Right. Like, it's sort of just make some changes to adjust to like the reality, because I think that's what's driving people crazy a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks to the whole team for joining, producers Mike, producers Dave, and clergyman Eric, longtime friend of the pod. I for one have learned a lot, and wish everyone, the playoffs are done, right? Like, even though the NFL playoffs continue to the Super Bowl, fantasy NFL is pretty much kaput for everybody.
Yeah, it ends a week before the end of the season.
Yeah. Okay.
Playoffs?
So
you can do playoff fantasy though. You do playoff based fantasy as well.
Yeah. So there we go. Now it's nothing but FPL for us for the next 6 months.
The great advantage, right?
It's until fantasy NASCAR starts back up soon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, baby.
We'll lose Eric. We'll lose Eric like we do every year.
Find him at @pitstop_junkie on Twitter.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. And yeah, maybe we'll do a round 2 of this next, late next summer.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Would love it.
All right. Take it easy, guys. Bye.
Later.